Good evening, everybody, and we are very happy to welcome all of our senior teachers and our friends to the July Trivandrum Neuro Club online meeting. We really miss meeting each other face to face, giving a handshake, and sharing a platform at a physical meeting. But definitely, the online meet also gives us a lot of advantages. One is that we are not restricted by time, and most of us can catch up with both, multitask, can also do our work while attending this webinar. So we are very excited today because we have many of our very senior teachers, Professor Madhusudan, Ananda madam, and also our young faculty members, Dr. Sinju and Dr. Natarajan, who will be presenting very fascinating viewpoints from neurosurgery and neurology today. We are very happy to also welcome many of our teachers, Professor Thomas Saip, Dr. Ajit, and many senior faculty, Dr. Krishna Kumar, and many others who have joined us. I can't see all the names, so I'll welcome one by one as the talks go by. Without wasting any further time, my proud privilege to welcome Dr. Madhusudan sir to speak to us about a very interesting case vignette, an interface between neurology and neurosurgery. The energy and enthusiasm with Madhu sir presents the cases, I think puts even the youngsters to a lot of shame. We have a lot of lessons that we have learned from Madhu sir over the ages, and I know that the case presentations that Madhu sir takes at Sri Chitra attracts a lot of audience, and people actually look out to it every week. And I'm sure that the new generation who has just joined neurology and neurosurgery have a lot to learn from Madhu sir. My proud privilege to welcome you, sir.
Okay, thank you, George, Dr. George, for the kind invitation and the profuse compliments which has rendered on me, which I really did not deserve. Now, without wasting time, I think I'll share my screen. I think just 1 minute. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, may I request all the participants to mute your sound if possible, please, because there is some audio disturbance.
So good evening to all of you. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. George and Dr. Thomas Hype for inviting me to part of this Neuro Club meeting this month. Now, I'll be presenting two cases which interface between neurology and neurosurgery, in the meaning that the cases look like neurological or neurosurgical, but turned other way around. So let me start with the first case. I think anyone can ask questions in between, can unmute and ask, or question me whatever I have thinking. There's no problem in between. So I'll start with the first case. This is a story of a 56-year-old man. His complaint started 1 year back. He developed subacute onset of weakness and numbness of both lower limbs. The weakness is more on the right side. He also complains of burning pain in the left leg and mild paresthesia of both hands. At the peak of the deficit, he was unable to walk unaided. This happened over a period of 3 weeks' time, the progression over 3 weeks, by which he became bedridden and was unable to walk, not bedridden, unable to walk without support. So in a nutshell, he has got subacute onset of weakness, numbness of both lower limbs, and mild paresthesia of the hand. He was investigated in a local hospital, and based on MRI, he was put on IV methylprednisolone and improved remarkably, so much so he was able to walk unaided. However, 6 months later, the weakness of the legs reappeared again, and again admitted to the previous hospital, and was put on the same injection, and again the weakness improved, but this time not totally, partially improved. Again, 3 months later, the weakness worsened. This time, the weakness of the lower limb was associated with significant. Audience may please mute their mic so that other people can hear. Again, 3 months later, the weakness worsened, and this time the weakness of the lower limb was associated with significant weakness of both hands, and was put on IV methylprednisolone, followed by azathioprine, which is immunosuppressant, as you all know. His weakness again improved, but not fully. 1 month back, his weakness of the lower limbs and hands worsened again while on treatment, and that is how he got admitted to our present hospital. So this is the video of the patient. I'm not sure, I'm not going to show all the findings, but the relevant findings I will show. I think they will give an input into my history, the history part of history examination part. He's got weakness of the hand grips, as you can see, both sides. The proximal muscles were normal. Triceps is normal. The lower limb tone appeared normal. There was weakness of the left as well as right lower limb, but weakness is more on the right side. But 4 to 4 plus on the left side, but 3 to 3 plus on the left side. With significant weakness of those impression on the right compared to the left. The reflexes, biceps and supinator were normally elicited bilaterally. But yet, both triceps and finger flexion jerks were very slightly more on the right side. Both knee jerks were exaggerated, and ankle jerks were also whisked, but not as whisked as the knee jerk. And both pandas were upgoing. Under the sensation, he was telling that pain is less on the left side of the body and is pointing to the level in which he feels the pain. There he is feeling the pain. On the right side, is all normal. Coming to the vibration, it was normal on the right side, the finger as well as the thumb. It was impaired on the left little finger. But it was present normally over both feet. I'm checking the joint position sense. Is it correctly on the thumb? Again, left thumb it was normal. It was impaired on the left little finger.
Yes, sir.
I'll summarizing the finding. Tone is normal. Power, upper limbs, weakness of both hands.
Sir, LP. Sir, sugar, sir, sound 50 or not. Protein is 120.
Can you mute them? Please? Yeah. The upper limb.
Sir, I muted them, sir.
Yeah. So power, upper limb, weakness of both hand grips and small muscles of both hands. Rest of the muscle power is normal in the upper limb. In the lower limb, both lower limbs are weak. Weakness is more on the right side. Just 3 plus to 4 on the right side, 4 plus on the left side. Deep reflexes, normal biceps and supinator bilaterally. Rest of the DTR were brisk. Panda response are upgoing bilaterally. Sensory system, pain is impaired in the left lower limb up to the trunk up to the D4 on the left side. Just entirely normal on the right side. Vibration GPS sensation decreased in the left little finger compared to the right side. Rest of the lower limbs were normal. So this is the findings in this patient. Relapsing, remitting weakness of upper and lower limb and upper limb in the hands, with the sensory level for the pain on the left side up to D4. So this was the MRI taken 1 year back, that is in August 2018. This is, I will show the MRI one by one. This is the T1 weighted sequence. Nothing much except for the small disc prolapse which you can see between C4 and C5. This is the T2 weighted sequence, shows a long extensive hyperintensity spanning from, say, lower border of the C2 up to C6 vertebra. And it was present throughout. It was something like a spindle-shaped hyperintensity, which you can see, but maximum hyperintensity was seen opposite this level. Then again, another cut showing the hyperintensity. This axial cut showing that at C4, C5 level, the hyperintensity was mainly seen inside the cord. Here you can make out the hyperintensity. Again, at C5, C6 level also there is hyperintensity in the cord. At C6 level also it was there. But C6, C7 level. And C7, D1, it was no hyperintensity in the cord. There is extensive longitudinal hyperintensity seen inside the cord. And the contrast showed a focal area of dense enhancement spanning anteroposteriorly at the level of C4, C5, like this, like a segment of hyperintensity, an enhancement which can be seen. Now, considering this possibility of LETM, long extensive transverse myelitis picture, so we wanted to rule out conditions like the people wanted to rule out conditions like NMO or other conditions like sarcoid, etc. So they took a brain MRI. Brain MRI was seen here, that is essentially normal. The second admission, when the patient improved and again readmitted, so he's admitted again 6 months later. At that time, once MRI was repeated, we show again the same hyperintensity, but it is little less than what was there previously. This patient is already on steroid at this point of time. So again, you can see the hyperintensity in spinal cord. Axial cut shows hyperintensity, but it less than compared to the previous one. This is the post-contrast film. Again, shows a small area of hyperintensity spanning anteroposteriorly. But you can kindly note that it's present both anteriorly as hyperintensity enhancement is more anterior and posteriorly, and it is less in the central part of the spinal cord here. Again, you can see the hyperintensity there. This is axial cut. This time shows that hyperintensity was more in the periphery of the spinal cord, here as well as here. Again, the central part is little less compared to the peripheral part of the spinal cord. Now, this is the present MRI when the patient is admitted here with us. That shows the hyperintensity is much less compared to the previous one, even though his deficit is worsened. This is the picture now which is taken now. Again, shows central cord hyperintensity. Now, what do you think is the likely diagnosis in this patient? Is it recurrent demyelination? Is it sarcoidosis or something else? If anyone wants to give their opinion, they can unmute and give their opinion before I go on. Or shall I continue now?
Sir, I think Dr. Ajit has raised. His hand.
Please, Ajit. Ajit, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself. Probably the administrator has to do something so that Ajit.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Actually, this is a very interesting case because the patient has a focal area of hyperintensity, suggestive of either cord contusion or a demyelination or something with a contrast enhancement also.
Okay.
And surprisingly, there is a focal disc bulge there.
Yeah.
With the posterior ligament flavum hypertrophy, just like a pin cord is almost pinched there. So we don't know whether this patient is having a dynamic instability because during the cervical spine movements, the position of the disc and posterior ligament flavum will change and it can consistently compress the cord.
Okay.
Because if you take a MRI in a normal position, it doesn't show anything. Because the demyelinating illness, everything doesn't fit with this pattern because there will be a demyelination somewhere else or patient will have something of a different progressive pattern in the disease process. But this looks like a patient has a repeated damage to the cord, causing demyelination and the focal cord contusion and later going into the myelomalacia. So I suggest in the last MRI, we could have taken a contrast MRI whether to see whether this is enhancing or not.
No, the contrast was done, which was the same type of enhancement which was seen earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, anterior.
This is the thing they very well missed in the dynamic way, because we don't have a facility for a dynamic MRI our parts of these
Okay.
parts. So this sort of things we will miss when we don't do a dynamic MRI with the flexion extension and seeing the
That was not done. Okay, would you advise surgery in this patient or treat with what do you think, Ajit?
Actually, we don't have anything else to offer this patient.
Okay.
So we can take a chance and give option of a surgery to stabilize the dynamic instability, or else we can take a flexion extension cervical spine X-ray. But I don't think that don't show much because this sort of thing, the diameter is fixed, but on movement that will hit the different parts of the cord, anterior, posterior.
Right.
So posterior column is involved, and also spinothalamic tract is also involved.
Mainly spinothalamic, little less of posterior column.
Posterior column is involved. So that means that both the posterior and anterior involved. That is suggesting also a pincer type of compression in the cord.
In fact, enhancement is seen both anteriorly as well as posteriorly also.
Enhancement shows that there is acute inflammation.
Yeah. But all throughout these 1.5 years, the patient has been relapsing. Every time there was anterior and posterior enhancement, like a thin band-like enhancement.
Maybe of repeated. I am not stressing that this is, but this is a possibility that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, perfect, Ajit. Now let us see what has been done. This is a possibility considered. Now, it's a recurrent demyelination. Now, this is the old dictum which Dr. Vasudev has taught me. That I don't know, many of you don't know about Vasudev sir. He was the first neurologist in Trivandrum Medical College, and I was his student at that time. When I did my MD, he was my teacher. He said, even in recurrent collapsing remitting illness, the same side is affected again and again. Think of a compressive lesion. So this is a report. Now, what will you do in this patient? So in this patient, I did send for surgery straight away, and the patient improved remarkably, and we stopped all of the treatment. Now, I'll tell you what is this particular condition called as. This is called the pancake sign. See, you may not find much of compression at all. Compression may be very minimal, but there may be a cord lesion may be there. I'll tell you the reason. Subsequent slides will tell you the reason. The pancake-like sign is defined by a circumferential enhancement sparing the spinal cord gray matter on axial images located beneath the site of maximum stenosis with transverse band appearance on sagittal images extending less than one vertebral segment. It is related to the focal disruption of the blood-brain barrier. Now, this is from the case report. There are many case reports. One I have just got it here. The teaching neuroimages, pancake-like gadolinium enhancement suggests compressive myelopathy due to spondylosis. This is the story of that particular case report. It's a 41-year-old man developed progressive bilateral hand weakness and spastic paraparesis. MRI demonstrated cord edema and pancake-like gadolinium enhancement. Inflammatory and neoplastic causes were investigated and not found. He continued to deteriorate despite medical corticosteroid treatment. 1 year later, cervical decompression stabilized his clinical condition, but intramedullary T2 signal worsened. This is from the literature, the same picture as our patient. Exactly like the one and exactly like the pancake enhancement here. Here you can find out the focal hyperdensity. So pancake enhancement due to focal disruption may be a blood-brain barrier at the point of maximum stenosis strongly suggests cervical stenosis as the cause of myelopathy. The enhancement may persist even after successful surgery. Inflammatory and neoplastic myelopathies have long. If it had been an inflammatory and neoplastic myelopathic changes, we would have expected a little more longer rostrocaudal segment of enhancement. Here, the enhancement is always less than one vertebral segment, like a pancake. Now, this is from just for recommendation's sake. All of you know that, but just for the juniors, The schematic representation of the MRI grading system proposed by Kang et al. Grade 0 means absence of canal stenosis. Grade 1, subarachnoid space obliteration exceeding 50%. Grade 2, spinal cord deformity. And grade 3 is a spinal cord signal change, shows T2 signal change and shows contrast enhancement, Göttingen enhancement like a pancake. Now, what are the MRI characteristics of the subnormality? All these patients have intramedullary T2 signal hyperintensity, which is a constant finding. And its longitudinal extension is usually greater than height of 3 vertebral bodies. So one may essentially think that there is a demyelinating lesion, like that of an what is seen in an NMO lesion. This is seen in 60% of the cases. On sagittal images, its morphology was spindle-like shape, shaped in more than 3/4 of the patients. On post-contrast sagittal images, endomedullary flat pancake-like enhancement was seen in 60 to 75% of the patients, just like what is shown in the picture. And the longitudinal extension of the enhancement was less than the height of one vertebral body, with the transverse diameter always larger than the longitudinal diameter. On post-contrast axial image, this is another important finding. A circumferential enhancement pattern was detected in most of the cases. Now, this is a circumferential enhancement pattern which you see around the cord. If you see the picture carefully, here you can find the enhancement was around the periphery of the spinal cord. Again, here need not be anterior posterior, maybe on the side also in the peripheral enhancement. That's like shown in the schematic diagram. This is another patient from the literature showing the peripheral enhancement with the central part clear or less affected or not affected. Again, show the peripheral part. So the white pancake enhancement abnormality nobody knows. It was thought to be due to demyelination or due to this ischemia. So this, just like Ajit told, Ajit correctly pointed out that this is due to the compressive lesion, but you may find the compression is much less than what is seen in the MRI. But the cord lesion is secondary to that stenosis. Somehow it causes demyelination or inflammatory change in the cord, causing the disability. So this point has to be kept in mind, even though the patient improves, all these cases improves in steroid, because it is not the compression element per se is causing the damage. It is the secondary inflammation or demyelination is causing the damage. But the causative lesion is the compression. So I'll stop the first case. Before I go to the second case, any other questions or comments?
Sir, there were two questions in the chat box. One is from Dr. Satish Krishnan. We are very happy to welcome Dr. Satish Krishnan, who was a faculty in neurosurgery at Sri Chitra and now presently working in the United Arab Emirates. So Satish sir's question was that did you do CSF studies? And there were also a couple of other questions. I'll tell that later.
In fact, this case was extensively investigated earlier.
Maybe now the question seems a little out of place. But was CSF studies done was the question, sir?
It was done. It was showing only mild elevation of protein, no cells. And they did extensive work for all antibodies was done in this patient, which did not show. It was, they were all negative.
And there was a question from Dr. Indira asking if there was any disc pallor and what was the vision.
No, nothing. Cranial nerves are all normal. There is no pulpedema, no optic atrophy, no MRI changes in the brain.
Right.
Because the initial diagnosis from the other hospital was demyelinating disease. They were getting treatment as a case of sarcoidosis.
Dr. Madhu, excellent case.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Very nice case. So I just want your opinion. What was the radiology conclusion on the MRI? Because that report you just flashed it. What was their conclusion of the radiology report?
I'll just show this, sir. I'll just, I can show that. This is the radiology report. They said diffuse disc bulge at various levels, then altered signal C4 vertebral marrow. That's all there. There is a report which they mentioned. The spinal cord shows patterning at C4, C5 level with myelomalacia.
they have not mentioned about the pancake thing.
No, they are not mentioned about the pancake.
Okay. Very nice case, sir. Very nice.
Because this, because this happened to see this article in the Green Neurology. That is why I was little confident and the patient for surgery. They got operated in Gangaram Hospital, Coimbatore, and he was well after that.
What was his profession, you said? Job?
Sir, I forgot about it.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, just to mention that we have a very interactive and up-to-date audience here. In fact, just before you broke the diagnosis to us, there was a message in the chat box from Dr. Prabha which said pancake enhancement. So
Perfect. Very good. Very good.
Definitely commendable. Thank you, Dr. Prabha.
Congratulations. Yeah. So, shall I go to the next case?
Sure, sir. Thank you.
I'll finish with this case. I got many cases, but I'll finish with this case also. Okay, this is a 56-year-old female. Her complaint started 5 months back as facial deviation to the left with inability to close the right eye. So obviously, it's got the right facial palsy. She was put on treatment and the facial palsy improved. 1 month later, patient noticed pain and numbness over both shoulder region, which descended to the anterior and posterior chest in a jacket-like fashion, like what you see in syndromania, like jacket-like fashion. Pain and numbness has been persisting till the time of present admission. Around the same time, that is 1 month after the initial facial palsy, when the jacket-like sensory deficit developed, that is 4 months back, patient also noticed numbness over both forehead, which later spread to the cheek, jaw, and finally the entire tongue in 1 week's time, and then slowly improved in 2 weeks' time. We do not know what treatment patient had taken at that point in time. 1 month back, 1 month prior to our present admission, patient noticed buckling of her right knee while walking, as well as loosening of the chappal from the right foot, and numbness of both lower limbs extending up to the knees. 1 week back, she noticed hoarseness of voice along with difficulty in swallowing and nasal irritation. So obviously, there are multiple sites of patients are affected. One is the facial palsy improved, then developed the jacket-like sensory loss in the trunk, then developed the facial sensory loss that also improved. Then she developing this buckling, right lower limb weakness with the starting as buckling of the knee. Then now hoarseness of the voice. Now I'll show the video of the patient. Now the question is, I mean, this is not for you only. This prepared earlier. In this case, prepared earlier for some other people. So the answer is she's got right element facial palsy, intramedullary lesion of the upper thoracic cord affecting the corsney fibers, bilateral effect of the sensory division of the fifth nerve, or the interaxial lesion of the brainstem to account for the numbness of the entire face. Lower thoracic cord or chordaequina to account for the element weakness of the, because the weakness appeared element because the buckling started first, but that's not an absolute point. And she's got tendinous palsy. So multiple sites are affected. Now the examination, general examination was normal. This is the finding. I'm showing only the key positive finding, not the complete examination. She has got corneal left diminution on the right side. The facial palsy had improved. She had right tendinous palsy, which you can clearly see. Right current is going towards the left, right? And movements were normal. Upper limbs power are normal. Lower limb, there is weakness of the right lower limb. Left lower limb power is normal. It is weak on the right side. Look at the reflexes. He has got knee jacks were absent bilaterally, but ankle jacks are well insitable. You can call it like a brisk ankle jack. It's got positive suggestion of a spasticity which I'm not very sure. You tend to have a heavy possibly due to the weakness in the hip flexor as well. This examination finding. So I'll summarizing the finding. High benefits are normal. Cranial nerves decreased corneal reflex on the right, decreased pain on the right V1 distribution, right lengthener process. The motor system, tone normal, power normal in the upper limbs. The lower limb power was normal in the left lower limb, but weakness of all muscles was seen, or weakness on the right lower limb, all muscles were weak, but predominantly in the right reflexes and right dorsiflexes of the ankle. Deep reflexes, biceps supinae, decreased triceps reflex bilaterally, absent finger flexion. Knee jerk absent bilaterally, ankle jerks normal or even brisk. Plantas were mute. Sensation system, which I did not show, patient had decreased pain and touch and pain from D6 downwards bilaterally, and hyperesthesia was there from D2 to D6. Vibration normal in the upper and lower limbs. Joints is normal in the upper limb, absent. So these are the findings in this patient. Thrombus is positive. Gate Cori, I'm not sure of this positive, but it's positive. Now, what is the likely etiology in this patient? So it's a relapsing remitting illness.
It's not audible. Something wrong with the sound system.
Madhu sir, can you hear us? I think probably there was a drop in the signal. So we'll just wait for 2 minutes for sir to join back.
Yeah, yes.
Madhu sir is just joining.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, I'll share the screen once again.
Yes, sir.
Now, up to what level have you seen? I don't know. I'll start from the very beginning once again. Okay. Her complaint started 5 months back as facial deviation to the left, which enabled you to close the right eye. Was it put on treatment and facial pulse improved? Later, patient noticed pain and numbness for both shoulder region, which descended to anterior posterior chest in jacket-like fashion. Pain and numbness has been persisting till the time of present admission. Around the same time, that is 4 months back, patient also noticed numbness of both forehead, which later spread to the cheek, jaw, and finally the entire tongue in 1 week's time. then slowly improved in 2 weeks' time. We do not know what treatment patient had taken at that time. 1 month back, patient noticed buckling of the right knee while walking, as well as loosening of the chappal from the right foot, and numbness of both lower limbs extending to the knees. 1 week back, she noticed hoarseness of voice along with difficulty in swallowing and nasal irritation. So, what are the sites of lesion and what is the likely etiological possibility? These are the site of lesion the patient had. It's a right element facial palsy, which occurred 6 months back, which improved. Then she had numbness over the anterior part of the chest, suggesting an intramedullary lesion of the upper thoracic cord affecting the crossing fibers. Then she had numbness of the whole of the face, including the tongue, probably suggesting involvement of the bilateral fifth nerve or intraxial lesion inside the brainstem, cutting the crossing fibers from the spinal nucleus, the fifth nerve. And she had lower limb weakness, probably element, indicating a quadricular lesion or lesion in the epicornus or cornus region, that area is affected. And she had tendinous palsy. So she got multiple sites of affection in this patient over different times. Some of them has improved, most of them has improved with treatment. Examination, they're showing the video once again. The corneal was diminished on the right side. Facial palsy has improved. You have to try 10. Is the video seen?
Yes, sir. It's seen well, sir.
Okay. And she has the weakness of the right lower limb. Left lower limb has got good power, normal power. And she's also got weakness of the nosicle on the right side. The reflexes in both knee jacks were absent, but ankle jacks are well inseparable even on the meniscus side. And plantars are mute, and thrombus is positive. And suspicion is positive to the right lobe. Okay, so summarizing the finding, hyperfunctions are normal. The cranial nerves, she had decreased corneal reflex right side, decreased pain over right V1, right tendinous palsy. The motor system, tone normal, power is normal in the upper limb. The lower limb, normal power of the left lower limb. And weakness was there in all the muscles of the right lower limb, but predominantly of the right reflexes and right dorsiflexus of the ankle. DTR, upper limb biceps supinated normal, decreased triceps bilaterally, absent finger flexion. Lower limb knee jacks absent bilaterally, ankle jacks are well elicitable, plantars were mute. Sensory system, she had decreased touch and pain from D6 downward bilaterally, and there is some hyperesthesia from D2 to D6 bilaterally. Vibration normal in the upper and lower limbs. Joint sense normal in the upper limb, absent over the toes. So these are the findings. Ombus was positive. Coricor is positive, the right lower. Now, what is the likely etiology in this patient? So, it's a relapsing illness, affection of multiple sites in the neuraxis, some affecting the cranial nerves, some affecting the spinal cord, inside the spinal cord, and inside the brainstem. And there was good response. So it was the first consideration was of inflammatory demyelinating disease history-wise. Let us see the investigations. Then MRI dorsal spine showed hyperdensity within the cord, a spindle hyperdensity in the thoracic cord. Then a long extensive hyperdensity spanning from mid dorsal region up to the cornus. You can see there. I'll show another film showing the hyperdensity. But here the hyperintensity, this area is not affected. Hyperintensity is in anterior. Then this is axial cut showing the hyperintensity in the anterior part of the core. MRI brain showed two UBOs here and one area of hyperintensity in the subcortical and the temporal white matter. Other investigations blood a normal, total count was 7,900, ESR 30, calcium 9.9, CRP 1.2, peripheral smear normal, serum ACE level normal, ANA profile normal, serum aquaporin antibody negative. CSF was done, we showed 4 cells, protein 76 milligram, sugar 60 milligram. There was no abnormal cells in the CSF. Gene expert was negative. CSF ADA level was 3. CSF possibly was positive, but positive in both serum and CSF equal number of bands, so may not be significant. CSF ACE level was 12.3, that is normal range. Cryptococcal antigen was negative. Now, what do you think is likely diagnosis? Anyone would like to voice their opinion? If anyone want to ask further investigations, I can provide. Anyone want to voice their opinion just like the previous case?
So brainstem is normal in this case. Brainstem MRI you haven't shown. Posterior fossa MRI.
That's normal. T2 was normal.
Okay. X-ray chest, anything in the X-ray chest?
I'll show that later on.
Sir, we have some answers put up on the chat box.
Please,
So
please.
I'll just read them one by one. Dr. Bindu Tangapan from SCT Hospital says gives 2 differential diagnoses. One is sarcoidosis and second is demyelination.
Yeah.
Satish Krishnan sir offers the DD of demyelination. And Dr. Prabha sarcoidosis and Ayush. And there is one more participant whose name is not clear who says MOG with conus involvement.
Okay. Now, what investigation would you like to do? That's what my question is. The thing is, I have not shown you the contrast film. You want contrast, no? So I'll show the contrast. This is the contrast. This contrast shows that enhancement for the dorsal spinal cord that is near the dorsal aspect until the pile surface. Here. Okay. Then look at this contrast. This is axial cut. The hyperintensity T2 was anterior, but actual lesion was posterior. This hypointensity is actual lesion. That is enhancing with contrast. And that is abutting the pile surface. Okay. And this will tell you that this lesion is not a demyelination, because demyelination will produce hypointensity like that in T2. So initially demyelination, this hyperintensity, if alone you see, you may think demyelination. But the culprit lesion was actually hypointensity. That means it's a highly cellular lesion. The nuclear cytoplasmic ratio is increased. So cytoplasm is semi-less. It may suggest either a lymphoma or a granuloma. That's the thing you have to keep in mind. Granuloma can be tuberculoma or a sarcoid, non-infected granuloma. That possibility has to be kept in mind. And this again, you see the hyperintensity is abutting the pile surface. If the hyperintensity is abutting the pile surface, the first DD should be sarcoidosis. Again, the brain MRI contrast shows the brain, nothing in the brainstem, but see the meninges. There's a pachymeningeal enhancement, and this is irregular nodular pachymeningeal enhancement. You can see the enhancement of the pachymeninges, and leptomeningeal enhancement as well. And tendinum shows enhancement of the tendinum, which I can make out here. Again, you can make out the enhancement of the tendinum here on the right side, the Krishna right tendinum also. Now the diagnosis becomes a little more easier. Now, what diagnostic innovation do, as Sajid was pointing in the telling, X-ray chest, which shows hilar lymph node enlargement. So many of the people have answered the correct and answered correctly, like sarcoidosis, they're perfectly right. And this is the gland there. It's a CT thorax showing multiple glands, and The final test was endobrunchial biopsy was done, which shows granulomatosis lymphadenitis, showing sarcoidosis. And the patient was put on 60 milligram Visanode. Just after 2 weeks, patient started walking. The only finding left was tandem, expected positive tandem walking. Otherwise, abnormal tandem walking. Otherwise, everything is clear. Everything is clear. So the take-home points is that all remitting leptin illness are not demyelination. And before diagnosing demyelination, what should see that the clinical picture should conform to MS or other demyelination. So these are the things which I will go into that. In the clinical features of it, you have to look at the red flags, the typicalities. That should make you think away from a demyelination. Just because you have multiple lesions in the brainstem or the spinal cord or the brain and lapsing goes do not come to the conclusion of a demyelinating disease. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Before I close, any questions or comments from the audience?
Madhu, can I?
Yeah, please, Suresh.
You know, now regarding this case, the first case, say, what about the biceps reflex and pectoralis reflex? That was, you didn't mention about the pectoralis reflex, because, you know, if there is any compression above C5, the pectoralis reflex will get exaggerated, which will not happen if there is a compression from C5 down. And biceps, was it sluggish or present, or the previous case?
Yeah, that was shown. No, biceps supinated but normally elicitable. Triceps is brisk. So pointing to a lesion most likely at C5, C6 level.
No, but biceps you are telling is
not absent, elicitable. But the triceps and finger flexion is disproportionately brisk.
Okay, but there is no clue as to element finding.
No, definitely clue at element finding. It can be even behind cervical also.
Okay, very nice case. It was a great eye opener for all of us. Okay, that pancake. Okay, very good case, Madhu.
Okay,
So there's a question in the chat box asking if the AC levels were normal.
Yeah, both CSF and serum AC levels were normal. So telling you again that that's not a good marker for sarcoidosis. It can be normal even sarcoidosis.
Sir, what was the histopathology you had shown?
That was showing, sir, this thing. That's this histopathology. The section shows fragments of lymph node, epithelioid granulomas with Langerhans giant cells, scanty necrosis noted, no evidence of malignancy. So impression was granulomatous lymphadenitis. Suggestive of sarcoidosis.
Okay.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very, very fascinating presentation. You taught us so many new things. At the same time, it was also an exercise in lateral thinking out of the box. And most importantly, the message for the younger generation is the painstaking, meticulous bedside neurological examination, which you so wonderfully demonstrated in your videos. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that the lessons we have learned through your talk will be there with us as we go forward in our day-to-day clinical practice. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, George. Thank you.
George, Madhu, how do we exclude tuberculous granuloma?
Yeah, that's difficult, but the histopathology was not showing any evidence of any cases necrosis or any other features of tuberculosis. They were very sure about non-infective granulomatous condition.
Okay, thank you.
George, if time permit, I have one comment.
Yeah, please, Ajit.
Yeah, actually, in the first case, what is the problem with us? In many places, there is a dynamic MRI. If you do a dynamic MRI, we will be able to proceed with a diagnosis of a compression during the movements of the neck. Because otherwise, it is taken in a neutral position, that doesn't know the compression. But when the neck is in flexion extension, there is a compression. That is a dynamic compression. That actually it is a diagnostic test that we miss here or not available here. That is important in these cases.
Thank you for that wonderful point. Sir, we are also very happy to welcome many of our senior faculty from outside the city of Trivandrum to this webinar. Professor Meenakshi Sundaram, Dr. Ramani, and many others. We are very happy to welcome our guests from outside Trivandrum. And thank you very much once again, sir. For the next talk, it's my proud privilege to welcome Anandam Madam. Madam has been a pediatric neurology teacher to several generations of pediatricians and pediatric neurologists. And it is fascinating to see that childlike enthusiasm to present even at this level of seniority in Madam. And thank you so much, Madam, for accepting this invitation and for throwing light upon a topic which I'm sure many of us hardly know about. We know about so many viruses which are almost close to decimating the humankind. The Zika virus is probably one of them. Ebola and COVID perhaps needs no introduction to, has already shattered our lives. And a lesser known, but maybe something to fear in the future would be the Zika virus. And to present on Zika virus and neurology, may I invite Anandam Madam, please.
Dear Dr. John Svelanilam and Thomas I am extremely happy that you have invited VRS Hospital to present today's Neuro Club topics. And extremely thankful to you. And first, you have heard Dr. Madhu, wonderful presentation of case histories. And I thought at this age, I thought I would also present after a long time. And I thought Zika virus has come now after the coronavirus. And we have a few cases in children as well as in adults coming to our hospital. Now we already know that about 51 cases have been reported from Kerala, and a few are pregnant women. And why I presented is, can you hear?
Yes, madam, we can hear well and we can see the screen also well.
Okay. So we had two pregnant doctors who came to us for expert opinion regarding the congenital malformations which could occur after Zika virus infection. So that aroused that interest in me, and I thought I will share my views with you. And the Zika virus is just like the coronavirus, which is also looks similar to it. It is also an RNA virus, and it comes from the forest of Zika, Uganda, where the virus was first isolated in 1947 in monkeys, and later on in 1952, the first human cases were detected in Africa. And it also resembles the dengue, West Nile, yellow fever, and Japanese encephalitis. And so the symptoms may be similar to this, and the neurological manifestations also may mimic Japanese encephalitis or a dengue encephalitis in brain. And it is spread by Aedes mosquitoes during daytime, especially in the morning and evening hours, and also can be spread by sexual transmission and blood transfusion. And so this is about the virus. A pandemic of Zika in Brazil in 2015 led to involvement of this infection in many people, and this has led to many scientific papers on brain involvement and congenital defects in the brain. We are worried about the congenital defects in the brain when a pregnant woman gets the infection. I have said that Kerala has reported about 51 cases in our hospital, so we had 2 cases. And the symptoms of Zika are usually mild. Sometimes there may not be any symptoms at all. They may leave unnoticed, and the fever may last for about 4 to 5 days. And erythematous maculopapular rash, that is the one which distinguishes it, and headache, joint pain, conjunctivitis, and they may have a generalized muscle pain, fatigue, and abdomen. So it may resemble like a viral fever, and usually it is self-limiting, and usually there is no mortality also. And this is a child who came to our one of our OPs and had mild fever and also conjunctivitis, and the sibling was also affected, and the child had rashes, erythematous maculopapular rash over their arms and chest. And in acute stage of Zika, the brain can be involved in the form of encephalitis or myelitis or vasculitis in the brain. In pregnancy, that is the most important thing, where the first trimester can lead to congenital Zika syndrome, and miscarriages can also occur. Post-viral, rarely Guillain-Barré syndrome has also been described, but these complications are all very rare. And the Brazil study, they had studied about 87 infants who are congenital Zika syndrome, and their sera was screened for other congenital infections like TORS infections, which occur in pediatric age groups. And all the samples, in the tested samples, they were positive for Zika immunoglobulin. So made sure that these children were suffering from Zika infection, and majority of the children were in term. So the studies showed that the fetal ultrasound in those cases, actually it's coming from the Brazil study, and fetal ultrasound showed 90% involvement, calcification in ventricular calcification by CT, ventricular enlargement, cortical hypogyration, cerebellar hypoplasia, arthrogryposis was found in, that is stiffness of limbs, and unilateral diaphragm paralysis was seen only in about 3 patients out of 87. And so this head circumference starts reducing from the first trimester and goes on, and these children usually have a severe microcephaly. And it is the vertical transmission of the virus, just like the coronavirus also can transmit the virus to fetus through placental infection. So autopsy of these fetuses have shown gross and microscopic neuropathological abnormalities. Direct cytopathic effect of the infection by Zika was confined to brain. So the ophthalmic manifestations are also very common in the congenital Zika syndrome, and they had optic nerve and optic disc abnormalities. Bilateral involvement was there, mainly macular area was involved, and with congenital glaucoma was also reported. So mainly the head and the eye findings were important. And rarely in acute cases, the encephalitis I have already mentioned, encephalitis, meningoencephalitis, and acute disseminated encephalomyelitis or myelitis as such, cerebrovascular complications like vasculitis and vasculopathies, seizures, just like in any other viral encephalomyelitis, the presentation can also occur in Zika. This is from the literature. The hyperdense lesions were seen in the brain as well as in the spinal cord. So advice to pregnant women: what happens when somebody becomes pregnant and they get infection with Zika? And the thing is, serial maternal ultrasound scan should be done. And if RT-PCR or the IgM is positive, we would like to tell them to terminate the pregnancy within 16 weeks, because we do not know whether the effect may be coming later on. Even though it is the first trimester, the microcephaly can proceed, and so they can determine maybe having a low head circumference. And so better to, this is the advice I gave to the 2 pregnant doctors actually, and they were very reluctant to do it because it is very difficult to make a decision. And so if negative, I think it is a difficult situation again. Counseling can be done, look for fetal abnormalities and decide with serial antenatal USS. And one doctor was asking whether I should go for a fetal MRI to look for any abnormalities. So this is a very difficult situation when one becomes positive. And the diagnosis in an acute case, those children, 2 children whom I showed, they were positive, and the test was done in Medical College Trivandrum. After 5 to 6 days of fever, molecular testing, just like RT-PCR, can be done, the test of choice. Serum and urine samples may be used, because sometimes after the viremia, the viruria, that is the viral excretion, can continue in urine, and so the urine RT-PCR also may be done in such cases. And IgM to Zika can be detected as early as 3 days after the onset of illness by ELISA technique. So these tests are now available and we can make use of it. and only symptomatic treatment and no vaccine has been found. So the message of relief is the African lineage of the virus was found in patients since 1954. And from there, it traveled to Southeast Asia and India in 1970. And this strain is called the Asian lineage. And several reports which we have seen in the Jaipur outbreak and other places, not much associated microcephaly and other neurological disorders. So the thing is, the Indian variant is not much complicated by microcephaly or congenital Zika syndrome and neurological disorders. But the thing is, a Zika variant from South America, Brazil, that variant can mutate and spread to India and can pose a threat. So unless we do a genomic studies, we cannot find out whether we are dealing with a South American variant or an Asian variant. So anyway, just to throw a light on Zika, I just presented a short presentation. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, madam, for that very fascinating presentation. Most importantly, for ending it with a touch of hope, because we always feel that we are losing the fight against the viruses, but you gave us a lot of hope at the end of it. The floor is open for questions, please.
Madam, your patients, the two pregnant patients, which how many weeks were they present at? Which trimester? You didn't mention the two doctors.
They, I think, 12 weeks and not beyond 15 weeks. Two doctors came and asked me. One, I think, is 12 weeks, and another is also another actually has crossed 16 weeks. So they are worried. One pregnant doctor is about 12 weeks, and so they are just waiting for the result. So they only discussed with me and then said this could be a variant. So the Asian lineage or Asian variant will not have much microcephaly and much damage to the fetus. So that is important. So the genomic studies only will help us. Now we are sending the samples to Coimbatore for doing the IgM studies. RT-PCR is done in Medical College.
Are they doing the genomics in Coimbatore, madam?
No, I don't think so. Because this is looking at the literature, I found out that there is a variant. And so now the number is increasing day by day in Trivandrum. We have got about 51 patients now. So beware of the Aedes aegypti mosquito.
For the benefit of our residents who don't know Professor Thomas Titus, who just asked this question, Titus sir has been a regular fixture at all our neuro clubs, and the energy and enthusiasm with which sir attends the neuro clubs will make you feel that he is maybe a professor of neurology, but sir is an acclaimed cardiologist and a pediatric cardiologist retired from Sri Chitra Hospital. And I think sir's attendance at the Neuro Club is much more than all the other of us combined together. Thank you very much, sir, for those wonderful questions. May I ask you, are you concerned with a potential cardiological manifestation of Zika, which might develop as the cases build up?
No, I think
myocarditis or anything like that, which the UV viruses cause.
No, I don't think that is actually. I think it is more neurological.
Neurological and congenital.
Yeah.
Not much.
Unlike the other. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, madam, for accepting this invitation and for throwing light upon such a rare topic, which I am sure was an eye opener for many of us. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And a lot of chat messages. Dr. Bindu Thangapan has thanked madam, and many others have appreciated your talk very much, madam. Thank you so much. And we are very happy to have 56. There were about 62 participants, which is a very, very big number.
George, can I ask a question to madam?
Sure, Satish sir. Please go ahead.
Madam, good evening.
Good
Nice
evening.
listening to you, madam.
Fine, how are you?
How common is Guillain-Barré after Zika, madam?
No, not yet. I think in the Indian scenario, not much neurological things have been, complications have been reported. So that's a good thing about it. So people are worried now, but it is not much. There was an outbreak in Jaipur some time ago, and there also the neurological complications are very much less. I think almost nil. So it is rare.
Okay.
So I think we are having that Asian lineage, luckily, unless something comes and mutate and then again start doing all the harmful things. At
Oh.
present, I think if Zika comes, nothing to worry, as long as we have the Asian lineage.
Thank you, ma'am.
Madam continues to give us hope in the world decimated by many viruses. Thank you once again, madam. And we have, more than 60 people, 60 neurologists, neurospecialists in this in the audience today, and having being able to command the attention of this audience without the usual fellowship of food is a feat by itself. Thank you very much, madam.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I now invite Dr. Sinju Maniyangat, Senior Consultant in Neurology from PRS Hospital. Dr. Sinju is known to all of us as a very kind, compassionate, and a very gentle neurologist. And he has also had special training in stroke, which is very close to his heart. And Dr. Sinju will be speaking to us about a very rare cause of encephalitis. Welcome, Dr. Sinju.
Respected teachers, senior faculty, and my dear friends, I first of all thank my professor Thomas Hype sir and Joseph for giving me this opportunity. So we'll straight away go to our case. Our patient is a 64-year-old lady. Now she had a history of rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and hypertension in the past, and she was on treatment for this from Medical College Trivandrum. But unfortunately, for the past 1 year, she was not able to go for follow-up, and she was on methylprednisolone 16 milligram twice a day for the last 1 year. Now her symptoms started on 24th last month, and first symptom was she developed headache, and this headache was severe diffuse headache. She was seen in the
Your screen. I'm sorry.
Share your screen.
Yeah, your
Please
screen
share
is
your
not shared.
Sorry.
Please share your screen. We are not able to see your screen.
One second, sir.
താഴെ ഒരു പച്ച ഇതില്ലേ ഷെയർ സ്ക്രീൻ കൊടുത്തിട്ടുണ്ട് പച്ച ബോക്സിന്റെ അകത്ത്.
Okay, sir.
To chat between chat and record.
Just do one thing. I'll just.
ആ കഴ്സർ താഴോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവന്നാൽ മതി സിഞ്ചു. If you bring it down, you'll find the icons will open up. There's a green button, share screen.
Okay, 1 second, sir. Okay, is it visible, sir, now?
Yes.
Yeah, it's seen, yeah.
Okay, shall I
Yes,
start
yes.
once again? Our patient is a 64-year-old person lady. She had history of rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and hypertension in the past, and she was on treatment from medicine department, Medical College Trivandrum. But due to the COVID crisis, she was not able to go for follow-up for the past 1 year, and she was on methylprednisolone 16 milligram twice a day for the last 1 year. Her symptoms started on 24th last month. She developed severe headache since morning, and she was seen in local hospital and was given symptomatic medication saying that it was only hypertension. But by noon, she developed persistent vomiting. It was so severe that she was coming to the hospital when they noticed that she has become agitated, disoriented, and started having altered behavior. By evening, she was severely agitated and they had to rush her to the casualty. On taking history, they told that there was history of feverishness for the last 2 days because she was saying there was myalgia, generalized tiredness, rigor chill feeling, etc. But there was no history of vertigo, limb weakness, or ataxia or seizures. And there was no abdominal pain or diarrhea along with the vomiting. And there was no history of COVID vaccination also. In the casualty, she was febrile. Her BP was mildly elevated at 160/90 millimeter of mercury. She was conscious and disoriented, severely agitated, thrashing all her forelimbs. So there was no positive limb movements and there was no neck stiffness. So the possibilities we considered were one, whether it could be encephalitis because she had headache, vomiting, and altered sensorium. Two, stroke. Whether it could be hemorrhagic stroke with headache and vomiting, followed by agitation. Three could be sepsis with encephalopathy because she was immunosuppressed for the last many years. So with Medrol going on, she was maybe having some sepsis and which was presented as encephalopathy. Four, whether it was a CNS vasculitis acute presentation in view of history of rheumatoid arthritis. So with these four possibilities in mind, we started evaluating her. The initial investigations revealed a highly elevated CRP of 116 millimeter, 116 with a normal ESR, and the other investigations were normal biochemical investigation. So we proceeded with MRI, and MRI was essentially normal except for this chronic ischemic white matter changes. So we did a CSF study that showed an elevated protein of 94 milligram percentage, mildly decreased sugar, and 2 cells were seen in the CSF. Her ADA was normal, HSV PCR, TB gene expert, and cryptococcal antigen was awaited. We did other investigations also. ANA was negative, RA factor and CCP was highly positive. Her serum procalcitonin was normal, ruling out a sepsis, and dengue was also done because it was a dengue season at that time. Then we started her as usual on injection monos of injection acyclovir, it was a encephalitis, meningoencephalitis. But on that day in our CAN group, there was a case report by Dr. Joy, which showed a boy around 18 years, developed alteration of behavior, 2 days becoming aggressive, etc., etc. And one comment from Dr. Sharath was, it is time to watch for MIS-A and MIS-C after peak of second wave. So we thought whether this patient could fit in with this MIS-A criteria. So our question was, is this neurological multisystem inflammatory syndrome adult? That is MIS-A. MIS-A means multisystem inflammatory syndrome in adults, secondary to COVID-19. The criteria was, patient should be having a severe illness requiring hospitalization. Being adult, it was at least 21 years old. So that criteria we had achieved because patient was already admitted. Second was a positive result for current or previous SARS infection. The antigen, antibody, or nucleic acid, anyone can be positive during the admission. Third one was severe dysfunction of one or more extrapulmonary organs. Although brain is not included in this list, in our patient, brain is involved, so there is a severe dysfunction of one extrapulmonary organ system. Fourth was lab evidence of severe inflammation. So we had elevated CRP, but we had to look at the other parameters also. And absence of severe respiratory illness, that was also present in our patient. So we thought that we should check for the antibody level. And to our surprise, the COVID-19 antibody IgM was detected, IgG not detected, meaning that this is a recent infection because IgM becomes positive around 2 weeks after COVID infection and IgG was detected after 4 weeks. So that means she had some COVID infection which was not symptomatic, and the bystanders also denied that no one in the family had COVID. So in our patient, the test for current or previous COVID infection, TUNAT was negative before admission. We did a RT-PCR that was also negative, but COVID IgM is positive, IgG negative. So she fits with positive previous COVID-19 infection. Now, but this is not enough. We have to prove that there is inflammation. So we sent for all other inflammatory markers. CRP was already elevated. D-dimer was around 6 times elevated. BNP was around 4 times elevated. LDH was elevated. TROPI was also elevated. Meanwhile, the CSF other results came. HSV PCR was negative. TB gene expert was negative. Cryptococcus antigen was also negative. So we can now fit this patient in the criteria with these criteria to multisystem inflammatory syndrome adult. So we started her on injection methylprednisolone 1 gram IV once a day for 5 days. She was continued on acyclovir till the HSV PCR results came as negative, but she had dramatic improvement within 24 hours. And she was also started on the low molecular weight heparin in view of elevated D dimer and echo showing a LV dysfunction with EFO ejection fraction of 45%. And by 5th day, she became perfectly normal and she was discharged. And the inflammatory markers also dropped rapidly. You can see that the CRP from 26, it came to 14. Then D-dimer also came back normal, it's less than 0.5 is normal. The other things also had a downward trend. So finally, we concluded that this patient had multi-system inflammatory syndrome of adult variant, which is most of the COVID infection was masked because of her intake of methylprednisolone, and she recovered fully without the use of IVIG. With in injection soluble itself, she became normal. And you can also, one more interesting finding was this lymphocyte count, which was 16%, dropped down to 5%. Severe lymphopenia. This is also typical of COVID infection, severe lymphopenia. So these were the findings in this patient. So we have got a new criteria in which the neurological symptoms has also been included. This is the case definition by CDC. They say that there should be subjective fever or documented fever more than 24 hours prior to hospitalization with 3 following clinical criteria. At least one must be primary clinical criteria. The primary clinical criteria is severe cardiac illness, which includes myocarditis, pericarditis, etc., or ejection fraction less than 50%. And the secondary neurological clinical criteria, we have got neurologic symptoms like encephalopathy without prior cognitive impairment, seizures, mental signs, or peripheral neuropathy, including Guillain-Barré syndrome. So our patient had encephalopathy. She never had seizures. And the other parameter, the third one is a lab evidence. At least 2 of these should be there. Elevated CRP, ferritin, ESR, procalcitonin, IL, or interleukin 6, and a positive SARS-CoV-2 test during current illness by RT-PCR or antigen detection or serology. So this definition also we can fit with our patient. So we went with the literature search. This was the largest series which we could get. This is a case-based review from Turkey, actually. It was published in March 2021, and they had 51 cases, which was collected from all over the world. And they never reported about any neurological findings in this one. But one older article from last year, which is from JAMA, they had collected 15 patients. And these 15 patients, the neurological symptom is in this color. You can see that this patient E had neurological symptoms along with renal involvement. So neurological symptoms are present in our MISA, and we have actually seen 2 more patients in this last 1 month. Actually, what we do is if we find some atypical, those 2 patients had seizures, and all other investigations were almost normal. So just we sent for COVID IgG and IgM, and both of them turned out to be IgM positive, and both responded to injection methylprednisolone. And now the next question was whether this COVID vaccination can also precipitate an MISA, that is our multi-system inflammatory syndrome. So this is this month's present article. It shows MIS after SARS-CoV-2 infection after COVID vaccination. And you can see that this first patient had a vaccine about 12 days prior to this symptom onset. And the second patient had first dose of vaccine 42 days prior to this COVID onset. And after COVID also, he went again with a second dose. And after 4 days after second dose, he developed this MS. So whether it was due to the
Fruits and
COVID or due to the vaccine. And the third patient also had a infection days prior. Okay, vaccine 19 days back, and then we can say that COVID vaccine can also produce MS. This is from California. So it could be Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. We are not sure about our Covishield and here. So, but we can see that there is definitely vaccine can also give MIS. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinju. We have some disturbance in the audio. I'm not able to identify from where it is coming till I mute it.
ഐസ്ക്രീം എല്ലാത്തിനും വരും അല്ലേ? സാങ്ക്രിയൊക്കെയോ? അതില്ല.
Mute all.
ഗ്രീൻ ആപ്പിൾ ഐസ്ക്രീം ഇടോ? അല്ല അതിട്ടോ, പഞ്ചസാരയും ഐസ്ക്രീം ഇല്ലാത്തത് മതി.
George,
വേണം.
iPhone.
പഞ്ചസാരയും ഐസ്ക്രീമും വേണ്ട.
Named iPhone. It's not
അതല്ല,
named.
ആപ്പിൾ അല്ല, അത് സിന്തറ്റിക് സാധനം.
Yeah, I think now we are good to go.
Muted. He heard what I am telling.
Sinju, thank you very much for throwing light upon very contemporary and an aspect of COVID which I think many of us were not very well versed with. I'm sure there are a lot of questions which we can await from the audience.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, sure.
What about the echo? Did the ejection fraction improve from 45% to normal? Number one, and what was the proponent of the patient? And I think you are mentioning that it's not described with Covishield. I think the last Neuro Club, I think Cosmo presented a case after Covishield vaccine developing this particular Guillain-Barré syndrome. I think it was presented from Cosmo. So I think it is that patient had taken the Covishield vaccine. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Yes, this patient had only one echo, sir. Actually, we didn't repeat the echo. The initial echo showed an ejection fraction of 45%, but she was not that much symptomatic. There was no breathlessness. BP was stable. So we didn't repeat the echo. And the second thing was that I told this Pfizer and Moderna were the culprits in the case report they have published from California. Regarding Covishield, we do not know. We are also suffering from this Covishield vaccine-induced Guillain-Barré, etc. And so most probably this will also come in the recent times because the number of vaccinations is increasing. So we'll have to wait.
What was the cardiac proponent in this patient?
It was initially 54 and later it come down to around 48.
No, positive or?
Actually, in our hospital, it is more than 19 is taken as positive.
19. So this is, okay. Maybe borderline. Okay.
Borderline,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dieter sir, for making us remember the heart in between the brain presentation. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sinju. If there are no more questions, we'll move on to the next talk.
I had this question in the chat.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Among the inflammatory markers described in the sort of systemic inflammatory response to COVID virus, procalcitonin is also shown as one of the markers. But why do we test that in a virus-related inflammatory syndrome? Because it's a marker of bacterial, as far as I know.
Sorry, madam, I could not get any reference for this one. This is a CDC guideline. So they are telling it's procalcitonin is also included in that one. The earlier one, working definition, the procalcitonin was not included. In our patient, procalcitonin was negative also.
The guidelines here states that many COVID patients will get secondary infection. That is why procalcitonin is included in your armamentarium.
Okay. Okay, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Satish sir and madam, for those very thought-provoking questions. We'll now move on to. Thank you, Dr. Sinju, for that very contemporary and fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Bye. Good night. We'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Natarajan. We all know him as always hungry for knowledge and new experiences, be it neurosurgery or otherwise. Dr. Natarajan has a special interest in spine surgery, and he's trained from one of the oldest neurosurgical departments in the country, Madras Medical College. And it's a proud privilege to have Dr. Natarajan speak to us on spinal cord tumors. Welcome, Dr. Natarajan. We can see it well, Dr. Natarajan.
Natarajan, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Is it fine now, sir?
Yeah, it's fine now. Perfect.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, sir. I thank Trivandrum Neuro Club for giving us the opportunity to present in this forum. And I also thank my Executive Director, Dr. Ananda Madam, for giving me that hand to present here. And I also acknowledge my Senior Consultant, Dr. Madhusudanan, sir, and Dr. Janardhan Poti, sir, for helping me to do so. And it is indeed a privilege and a special circumstances for me to present along with some of the doyens in neurosciences, like Ananda Madam and Madhusudanan, sir, who are the teachers of teachers. And it is indeed a much more privilege to present in front of an audience, the senior most audience, I feel. And in fact, I'm starting the session with some palpitations and essential tremors of mine. And in fact, 3 years back, George sir was my examiner in Madras Medical College. And after 3 years, I think the situation is the same, but the format is quite different. Thank you, George sir. So I'll start this is my first presentation in Trivandrum Neuro Club. So I start the session with my tribute to my alma mater, which I consider the corpora quadrigemina of my dorsal midbrain. And also this is a special day. This is the, today is our International Tigers Day, which is our national animal. So on this special day, we'll start the session. So for the next few minutes or so, I'll be discussing about 4 cases in 4 different locations, like in lumbar, dorsolumbar, dorsal region, and cervical region, which covers 3 pathologies to insist on the surgical anatomy of 2 important structures with the utilization of 1 novel technique. So this will be our presentation. So I will keep the clinical examination in a brief. So the first case, this is a 55-year-old female who presented with low backache for 4 months and numbness over both lower limb for 3 months. The low backache, the pain was radiating to the right lower limb, and the numbness, it initially started in the right lower limb and the left lower limb. On examination, the knee jerk and ankle jerk was decreased in the right side. On imaging, this is a T1 contrast, which showed an enhancement with contrast, which is at the level of L3. This is the axial contrast, the T1 contrast, which shows the homogeneous enhancement with contrast at the L3, L4 level. So the probable diagnosis of a nerve sheath tumor is probably a schwannoma or a neurofibroma was made, and we proceeded with surgery. The incision was made and deepened, and laminectomy was done, and the dura was exposed, and then the durotomy was done. And this is how the lesion appeared. It appeared like a smooth globular mass, which was excised, which was found compressing the cauda equina. So this is a picture after the excision of the lesion. So the biopsy came out to be a schwannoma. So the schwannomas and neurofibromas, they are categorized under the nerve sheath tumor. So there are certain distinct histological and biological characteristics of schwannomas and neuromas, though they fall under the same roof. The neurofibromas, they predominate in NF1. The schwannomas are more common in NF2. The most nerve sheath tumors, they arise from a dorsal nerve root, although neurofibromas, they represent a higher proportion of ventral root tumors. And about 30% can have a dumbbell tumor by extending to the extradural compartments. And the schwannoma has a unique characteristics in the histopathologically with Antony A, Antony B, and Verroque bodies. The Antony A is the one where we have a lot of cells, and when there is a palisading of the nuclei, this is the palisading of the nuclei, which is when there is a palisading of the Antony A, it is called as the Verroque bodies. The Antony B is usually paucicellular. So this is the Antony A, which is highly cellular, and this is the Antony B, which is paucicellular. So these three are the characteristic features of schwannoma. The other important feature with regard to the schwannoma surgeries is that it is usually possible to preserve some fascicles of the nerve root, although sometimes a section of the entire nerve root is required. So new deficit may not occur despite being the sacrifice of these nerve roots, because the involved fascicles are usually non-functional and the adjacent roots may compensate for the same. The risk for motor deficits is higher with schwannoma. It is higher with cervical than rest of the tumors, and it is much more higher with the dumbbell tumors of the cervical origin. The outcome, the recurrence is usually rare following gross total resection, except in the setting of NF2. The second case, so this is a 45-year-old female presenting with low back pain for 4 years, with involuntary urination for 2 years, and difficulty in using both lower limbs for 1 month. The backache, which was present for 4 years, it was radiating to the right lower limb initially and then to the left lower limb. On examination, the knee jerk, all the lower limb reflexes were absent. The knee jerk, ankle jerk, plantar reflex, they were all absent. And the power was only 3/5 in the lower limb. And all sensation below L1 was markedly decreased, and the anal tone was also markedly decreased. The CT spine showed a lytic lesion from D11 to S2 vertebra, showing destruction of the vertebral bodies and the posterior elements. So this is the coronal section where we see significant destruction of the vertebral bodies from D11 to S2. And also in the sagittal view, we could also see the same. So a probable diagnosis of either secondaries or probably a schwannoma. So because we could see some scalloping in the within the lesion of the vertebral body, so we made a provisional diagnosis of either a secondaries because of the lytic nature, or probably a schwannoma or a chronic lesion which is producing the scalloping of these vertebrae. So the MRI showed a large size patchy enhancing T2 heterointense lesion from D8 to S2 level, and there was erosion from D11 to S2. So the lesion was highly erosive and haphazard, extending everywhere. The T1 axial also shows the same, which shows an heterogeneous enhancement with contrast. So we proceeded with the surgery of proceeding with the laminectomies in the lumbar region of L2, L3, L4. So the laminectomy was done. So the moment the laminectomy was done, we can visualize the lesion. The lesion was found to be highly vascular. So when we retracted the sac, we could also see the significant lytic lesions. So we did a subtotal excision at that level, and the biopsy came out to be a metastatic adenocarcinoma. We initially did a primary workup where we could not find any primaries in the chest, in the neck, and also in the abdomen. So this was a case of a metastatic adenocarcinoma of unknown origin. So we then subjected the patient to refer to radiotherapy, and the patient was on radiotherapy further on. The third case, so this is a 66-year-old female presented with chest discomfort in the form of band of constriction, difficulty walking for the past 6 months, the weakness of both lower limbs, left more than the right for the past 3 months, and numbness over the lower limb with the left more than the right. On examination, the power in the left lower limb was only 4/5 and the reflexes were brisk. So this was the MR myelogram where we can see an intradural extramedullary lesion which is displacing the spinal cord. And there's a T1 contrast coronal where you can clearly see there is homogeneous enhancement with contrast, compressing and displacing the cord. So this is the axial section. This is one level above, and here we can clearly, this is a normal spinal cord, and here we can clearly see the homogeneous enhancement of the lesion, which is compressing the spinal cord. So we did an cervical spine screening where accidentally we saw a lesion in the occipital region. So when we saw this lesion, we then went for a full study of the brain, where we found homogeneous enhancement in the left CP angle system and another lesion in the left temporal region and another lesion in the occipital region, which was homogeneously enhancing. So this was a case with multiple meningioma. So we had a suspicion of NF2. So we followed the criteria. We just made a brief history, discussed with the family, because there was multiple meningiomas intracranially and also in the spinal canal. So we had a suspicion of a MISME, multiple intracranial meningioma, schwannoma, and ependymoma. So we had a counseling with the patient relatives. There were no positive histories suggesting for the same. And then we subjected the patient to ophthalmological evaluation to look for any posterior subcapsular cataract, which was also in vain. So we localized the lesion to the, contributed the weakness to the D6 level. So we localized that and proceeded further with surgery. The surgery was done with intraoperative neuromonitoring. The lesion was marked and the laminectomies was done. D4, D5 laminectomy, D5, D6 laminectomy was done, and the dura was exposed under the neuromonitoring, intraoperative neuromonitoring, and the durotomy was done. And then we can clearly see the lesion, which is compressing and displacing the cord. So this was a lesion which was found significantly compressing the cord. And after excision, the dura was closed with 5-0-proline. And in the intraoperative neuromonitoring, this was a recording which was done before the durotomy. So before the durotomy, the recording showed no waves in the left tibialis anterior. There were no waves in the left tibialis anterior. And after the resection of the tumor, there were some positive waves from the tibialis anterior, left tibialis anterior. So the biopsy came out to be a grade 1 pseudomonas meningioma. And postoperatively, patient discharged walking without support. The fourth case, this is a 44-year-old male presenting with neck pain radiating to both upper limbs for the duration of past 5 months. And the power was only 4/5 and all reflexes were exaggerated and plantar was found to be extensor. So I have kept the clinical examination in a short to focus on the imaging. So the MR myelogram showed an intradural extramedullary lesion, which is compressing and displacing the cervical cord. The T2 is a T2 hyperintense lesion, which is showing the same, which is extending from the lower border of C3 to C6. The axial section also showing the homogeneous enhancement with contrast, compressing the cord. So we proceeded with surgery. The durotomy was done, and this exposes the lesion. And complete excision of the lesion was done, decompressing the cervical cord. So the biopsy came out to be meningioma again. So to a brief introduction to the spinal cord tumor classification. So this classified as intramedullary, intradural, extramedullary, and extradural tumors. So the commonest extramedullary tumors are the nerve sheath tumors, meningiomas, phylum terminal ependymomas, and the non-neoplastic lesions. The intramedullary tumors, the commonest are the astrocytomas, ependymomas, and hemangioblastomas. And the myelographic features shows the fusiform cord swelling in case of intramedullary tumors. In case of the intradural extramedullary lesions, there is capping effect with a sharp cutoff, which is called as the meniscus sign. And there can be cord displacement and asymmetric widening of the subarachnoid space. In case of the extradural lesion, we can have a complete block paintbrush appearance, or in case of incomplete block, we can have a hourglass appearance. So in a nutshell, for the approach to the spinal cord tumors based on the location for the intramedullary lesions, a child presenting with eccentric intramedullary mass within the dorsal cord, the most probable diagnosis is an astrocytoma. An adult presenting with central intramedullary mass with hypointense hemosiderin cap, the probable differential diagnosis is an ependymoma. A vascular lesion of cervical and thoracic cord is probably an hemangioblastoma. A child with long segment tumor with bony remodeling is probably a ganglioglioma or gangliocytoma. In case of an intradural extramedullary lesion, the commonest posterior thoracic mass with calcification and dural tail is a meningioma. A mass with enhancement but low centrally, which is called as a target sign, with hemorrhage and fat is called as a schwannoma. Without hemorrhage and fat is probably a neurofibroma. An enhancing cauda equina or a phylum terminal lesion with hemorrhage is probably a myxopapillary ependymoma. And with regard to the extradural location, a child with calcified enhancing extradural lesion, the probable diagnosis is a neural crust tumor. An adult with calcified mass with bony destruction, the probable diagnosis is a chordoma. So to conclude, the two main anatomical structures which I want to emphasize based on my presentation is that one is the denticlate ligament. So the denticlate ligament, so this is a spine model. This is a dissected spinal cord. So here we have a pile condensation. So this is a pile condensation. This is a triangular pile condensation which extends from the pile surface and attaches the cord to the dura. So there are about 21 pairs of such denticlate ligaments. So this is the triangular pile folds, which is located exactly midway between the two rootlets. So these are the rootlets, and the denticlate ligaments are located exactly midway between the two rootlets. So there are two main surgical significance for this denticlate ligament. The first denticlate ligament is of utmost importance because in case of foramen magnum meningiomas or upper cervical meningiomas, before retracting the spinal cord, cervical cord, it is important to cut the first denticlate ligament. And this denticlate ligament is closely related to the vertebral artery and the spinal accessory nerve. This first denticlate ligament also marks the intradural entry of the vertebral artery. So this intradural vertebral artery lies anterior to the first denticlate ligament, and spinal accessory nerve lies just posterior to the denticlate ligament. This first denticlate ligament is said to have some collagenous attachment to the spinal cord. So in case of foramen magnum meningioma or upper cervical cord meningioma, it is important that we first cut the first denticlate ligament before retracting the cord to avoid cord injuries. The other significance of the denticlate ligament is that the dentate ligament exactly divides separates the anterior to the dentate ligament is the spinothalamic tract, and posterior to the dentate ligament is the lateral corticospinal tract. So in order to locate the lesion, the lesioning for the cordotomy, especially for the unilateral cancer pain. So the lesioning is usually done as anterior to the dentate ligament. So this dentate ligament is used as a surgical landmark to locate the spinothalamic tract for lesioning, for producing cordotomy in case of unilateral cancer pain. And the second anatomical structure, which So the second anatomical structure, which I would like to say, is about the phylum terminal. So the spinal cord is held in position within the spinal canal by two structures. That is, we have an horizontal support and we have a vertical attachment. The vertical attachment is produced by the phylum terminal. The phylum terminal, it has two components, phylum terminal internal, phylum terminal external. So it runs, this phylum terminal, it runs for a length of about 20 centimeters. So phylum terminal internum, it starts from the conus medullaris. It starts from the conus medullaris, and then it is also a pile condensation. It runs for about 15 centimeters. The first 15 centimeters is the phylum terminale internum. So it runs for 15 centimeters and ends at the, this is the dural sheath. This is the end of the dural sheath at the level of S2 vertebra. And from the S2 vertebra, from the end of the dural sheath, the phylum terminale externum runs for another 5 centimeter, which attaches to the coccyx. That is also called as the coccygeal ligament. So this is the phylum terminale internum, which runs for about 15 centimeters, attaching the conus medullaris to the tip of the dural sac. And the phylum terminale externum, which is also called as the coccygeal ligament, it attaches from the S2 to the coccyx. So thus the spinal cord has an vertical attachment and also a horizontal attachment. The vertical support is provided by the phylum terminale. The horizontal support is provided by the denticulate ligaments. So thank you very much for the patient listening, and thank you very much for the opportunity given to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Natarajan, for that brilliant presentation. I think you really threw light upon several aspects of anatomy which were not known to us, especially the nuances about the denticulate ligament and the phylum terminale. Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. I would also like to welcome Professor Anil Pidambaran sir, Dr. Raja Kutti, Suresh Nair sir, to share a few views on this fascinating topic.
Thank you, George. The thing is, what he said about the first denticulate ligament is very important, because when you are operating on upper cervical meningium, especially anteriorly, you have to cut the denticulate ligament. So if you're not very careful, the denticulate ligament is partially attached to the vertebral artery as it enters. So it will be lying quite anterior, just anterior to the vertebral artery. So if you don't cut it carefully, the chances that you'll injure the vertebral artery when you're cutting the denticulate ligament. It's very important aspect which he said, and he's a very good anatomist. He's got a series of lectures. I don't know whether you know that. He used to send me a lot of them. He's a good teacher also, this Natarajan. So I congratulate you for this, really.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
I think our residents, many of them have benefited a lot from Natarajan's YouTube channel, which teaches anatomy from a very simple perspective, from a first-year residence or a second-year residence point of view. I think that is, once you are on the other side of the qualifying exam, you rarely think from a residence perspective. And that perspective, I think, makes Dr. Natarajan's videos very, very special. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Can I tell something, George?
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
And presentation, Natarajan, only one comment about one case you showed.
Yes,
that chorda equina, large lytic area which you showed, ultimately it's adenocarcinoma.
Yes.
In seconds, where scalloping means it's a long-standing lesion, and you told it's very extremely vascular. That is also against the adenocarcinoma. But the pathology report came as adenocarcinoma, no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It came as adenocarcinoma, sir. So
But
we did not find any primaries. Because preoperatively, seeing the nature of the lytic lesion, we screened for the primary test. Even we did a pan endoscopy and chest and abdomen. We could not find any lesions there, sir.
But what I am telling, of giant neurofibroma produce lysis can be extremely vascular. Scalloping of the vertebrae.
Yes, sir, yes, sir. So that's why our working diagnosis was in favor of neurofibromas or schwannomas, and then metastasis was our first diagnosis, and then the neurofibromas or the schwannomas because of the scalloping nature. But the pathology was quite different, sir.
Okay, but a very good presentation, especially the phylum terminal. We didn't know anything. But of course, the dentate ligament, everybody knows about the first dentate ligament, which is not the one thing which you should have highlighted there is, normally dentate ligament, they gets attached horizontally. You have shown that first dentate ligament goes rostrally. That is very important. It rostrally, and it goes between the vertebral artery and the accessory nerve. Very important. If you see the attachment is up only. from its origin, it goes up. Very nice. And the phylum terminal extremely well described. Thank you. How do you identify phylum terminal during surgery?
Sir,
That is-
it appears white in color. So when compared with the Cauda equina, it will appear like a white.
when you sometimes you have to cut the phylum terminal. You can sometimes it's very difficult to identify phylum from root. So how will you distinguish peroperatively? That also is highlighted. Okay, congratulations. Very good.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, sir, for adding those fine nuances to a fine talk by Natarajan. Thank you very much. I must also thank on behalf of the Trivandrum Neuro Club, Dr. Raja Kuti, who has taken time to join us off from his very busy schedule. Dr. Raja has tirelessly been organizing international webinars, and he shares with us, works all throughout the night to edit those videos and then put it across to us the next day. I think his contribution to academics in neurosurgery is beyond what we can comprehend. And on behalf of Trivandrum Neuro Club, I must profusely thank Dr. Raja. Dr. Raja has put up a small message in the chat box on giving us a few tips on how to do the webinar better. And we eagerly look forward to a one-day course from Dr. Raja on organizing and presenting in webinars. Thank you, Dr. Raja.
Hello. Thank you very much for those kind words, but I'm not actually an expert. These are few basic tips which I just wanted to share with you. Anyway, thank you very much for your very kind words. I am really honored to hear such good things from you, especially who is one of the epitomes of neurosurgery teaching. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you very much, and keep going strong, and our good wishes are with you. Natarajan, thank you very much. That was really a very brilliant talk, and it had we have in our audience today residents who have just joined the neurology and neurosurgery course. At the same time, we have senior faculty who have more than 40 years of experience in neurology and neurosurgery. So I'm sure that all the four presentations today have had some learning for both the youngsters who just joined today and also for the senior faculty. It was a fascinating evening that we had, and to keep such a large number of people spellbound without the food and the fellowship is definitely not a mean achievement. I must profusely thank on behalf of the Trivandrum Neuro Club all our speakers today, our teachers, Professor Madhusudan sir, Ananda madam, Sinju, and Dr. Natarajan for teaching us so many new aspects of neurology and neurosurgery which we were in the dark about. And let me end on this note from Natarajan that hope you find that key to success where nobody can change the lock. Thank you very much. And if there are no questions, perhaps we could end this session today.
Thank you very much for our invitation, your invitation, and I think we participated well.
Thank you very much, madam. It was very fascinating participation from everybody, and I must also thank each and every member of the audience here. Many of our audience members, Dr. Satish Krishnan and many others from.
In the next cycle, we may come again.
Sure, madam. We'll look forward to that, and I must profusely thank all our audience who took part so actively. And it's your vibrance which keeps meetings like this going even during these torrid times. We eagerly look forward to the time when we can meet face to face and come back to those old good times. And I'm sure that time is just perhaps round the corner. And till we meet again, on behalf of the Trivandrum Neuro Club, let me thank each and every one of you and wish you good night.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. Extremely good. Good night. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.